My husband walked out of the delivery room 3 hours after our daughter was born and said in the hallway, loud enough for the nurses at the station to hear, that the child was not his. He said I had arranged it. He said he would file before the week was out. I heard every word from my bed. I asked the nurse for a pen. I signed the discharge paperwork. And then I called Waverly, because I had retained her 6 weeks before the delivery for exactly the reason that I had learned over 4 years of marriage, not to be caught without paperwork. What Colton did not know, what he had never thought to ask about, what his mother had helped him forget in the fog of closing on a house and planning a wedding and settling into the particular comfort of believing the world moved on his schedule, was that his denial had just handed a federal probate court the legal mechanism to activate a $4.3 million trust that my grandmother had amended to include my daughter by name. He demanded proof of lineage. The proof confirmed everything, and the trust transferred 60 days later. Good day, dear listeners. It's Sienna again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say the worst moment is the moment of the accusation. In my experience, that is not quite right. The worst moment is slightly earlier. It is the moment you realize the accusation is coming. You can feel it forming across a room, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, and you understand, in the space of one heartbeat, that you have to decide right then who you are going to be. You can be the person who argues. You can be the person who explains. Or you can be the person who picks up the phone and calls her attorney. I had made that decision 6 weeks before the delivery. And I had made it because my grandmother Helga had taught me, without ever using those exact words, that preparation is not pessimism. It is respect for what is real. She used to say, "Know what the paper says before anyone asks you to read it." I had always thought that was about legal documents. It turned out it was about everything. Have you ever known something was coming that no one around you could see yet? That is a particular kind of loneliness. It requires a particular kind of patience. And it requires, above all else, that you do not let the loneliness show, because the moment it shows, someone will interpret it as guilt. I had learned that lesson inside my marriage, and it served me well at the end of it. My name is Linnea. I was 34 years old in the spring that this happened. I was a pediatric occupational therapist, a profession that requires you to assess a child's developmental situation with precision, without sentiment, and without allowing the anxiety of the family around you to infiltrate your own clinical judgment. You sit on the floor with children who cannot yet tell you what is hard. You observe. You document. You go home and write the report the same day, because the same day report is the accurate one, and accuracy matters in a way that patience and good intentions do not always replace. I had brought those professional habits home. The Yarrow family had always described this as coldness. Colton and I had met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital in Boise. His firm had sponsored a table, and my department had been given 2 complimentary tickets. And I had gone because my supervisor had asked me to represent the clinic. He was tall and socially fluent in that specific way of a man who has never needed to work very hard to make a room like him. He was charming in the way of someone for whom charm has always been sufficient, which meant he had never developed the layer beneath charm, the layer that does what it said it would do when the room is empty. I know that sounds like a conclusion I reached later. In some ways it is. But there were signs even then, small ones. He was attentive when attended to and slightly absent when the attention shifted to someone else. I noticed, and I filed it. I had a habit of filing things that did not yet have a category. We married 2 years after that fundraiser. I was 31. He was 36. The wedding was at his mother's suggestion, small ceremony, large reception, the Yarrow family's church in Meridian, and a guest list that was, in the final count, weighted 70% toward his side of the room. I had not minded at the time. I had 3 close friends, my mother Bet and my grandmother Helga, and they were all there, and that had felt sufficient. The Harris Ranch house was Colton's idea, and also a good idea. A newer construction in a neighborhood of newer constructions. Clean lines, good light in the mornings. A study that we had not yet finished filling because the delivery came 3 weeks early, and the last thing on my mind was wall art. I loved Boise. I had grown up in Twin Falls, 2 hours south, and I had moved here for my graduate program and stayed because the city had a particular quality, small enough to know your neighbors, large enough that you did not have to. The Boise River ran through the Greenbelt near the north end, and in late March it carried the snowmelt from the mountains and had a color that was almost too green, a color that seemed impossible for water. The mornings that spring were cold and bright, the kind of cold that lives in your lungs, and the afternoons had a sharpness to them that felt like the world paying attention. I had been doing prenatal occupational therapy consultations at the hospital, where I would later deliver, because the department had expanded into maternal support, and so I knew that floor better than most patients do. I knew the nurses by name. I had brought pastries on a Tuesday in February. I knew exactly where the station was relative to the delivery rooms, and I knew that sound carried in that hallway. That is relevant. That will matter. My grandmother Helga Svensson had died in October, in the 6th month of my pregnancy. She was 84. She had come from a family of dairy farmers in southern Minnesota and had married a civil engineer who built roads in Idaho and had a particular faith in documentation that was, she used to say, the only religion that never disappointed her. She was precise and funny and occasionally terrifying, and she had always looked at Colton with a careful, neutral expression that I had chosen, for the duration of my marriage, to interpret as reserve. After she died, I understood it differently. But I am getting ahead of myself. Her estate was modest in some ways, and not modest in others. She had owned 3 pieces of property outright, a small commercial rental in Nampa, her house in Twin Falls, and a parcel of agricultural land that my grandfather had bought in 1979, and that had appreciated in a way he had not anticipated. The brokerage account was separately managed, conservatively, the way her generation managed money, bonds, dividend stocks, and the firm conviction that you did not spend principal. By the time she died, the trust held $4.3 million in combined real estate and brokerage assets. I had not known the figure until her estate attorney called me 3 days after the funeral, and I had not known until that same call that she had amended her trust document in July, in the 5th month of my pregnancy. 3 months before she died, to add a specific bequest, her unborn grandchild, described in the document as the biological child of Linnea Svensson Yarrow, was named as beneficiary of the full trust corpus upon proof of my lineage. The estate attorney, a methodical man named Brent Harlow, who wore the same style of glasses my grandfather had worn, explained the DINA confirmation requirement in careful language. He said my grandmother had included it because she had watched a dispute over her own mother's estate in the 1950s, a dispute about which child belonged to which branch of the family tree, and she had decided that ambiguity was the enemy of documentation. She had not been thinking about Colton. She had been thinking about a different generation entirely. But she had been thorough, as she always was. And she had been right. I listened to the entire explanation. I thanked Mr. Harlow, and then I sat in my car in the parking lot of the estate office for 11 minutes before I drove home. I want to be honest with you, dear listeners, about what I was thinking in those 11 minutes. Part of it was grief. She had been gone for 3 days, and I had not yet finished grieving her, and here was the fact of her money, which felt too soon and also exactly like her, because she had always hated loose ends. And part of it was something colder and clearer than grief I understood. In that parking lot, that I could not tell Colton. Not because the money was secret, it would not remain secret, but because I had learned, over 4 years of marriage, that Colton shared everything with his mother. Not maliciously, not as a deliberate act of disclosure, but as a reflex, the way some people check their phone when they are uncertain. He called Constance when he was unsettled. He called her when we made decisions. He called her when something happened that he did not know how to process yet, and she processed it for him. And the processed version was always, in some way that I had never been able to precisely name, less accurate than the original. I drove home and I did not say anything. I filed the information. I called Waverly Osei 3 weeks later. Waverly was an estate and family law attorney in downtown Boise, early 40s, steady, with the particular unhurried quality of a lawyer who has seen the inside of enough courtrooms to know that urgency, performed at the wrong moment, is a negotiating position and not a strategy. I had found her through a colleague at the hospital who had used her in a family property dispute. I trusted my colleague's judgment. That trust turned out to be warranted. I met with Waverly on a Tuesday in early December when I was 6 months pregnant and wearing a wool cardigan that barely buttoned anymore. And I told her everything, the trust amendment, the Dina condition, Mr. Harlow's explanation, and the state of my marriage. She listened without writing anything down for the first 12 minutes. Then she asked me 2 questions. She asked whether I believed the marriage was stable. I told her I believed it had been stable for 3 years, and that I was not sure about the 4th. She asked whether I was prepared for the possibility that it would not remain stable. I told her that preparation was the reason I was sitting in her office. She nodded and opened a file folder, and that was that. She retained me 6 weeks before the delivery. The retainer was $30,500. It was the most important $30,500 I ever spent. The first clue that things were already in motion was behavioral, and it arrived in December, about 3 weeks into my arrangement with Waverly. Colton had always called his mother on Sunday evenings. This had been the rhythm of the marriage for 4 years, reliable as weather. Sunday evenings, 20 minutes, usually while I was doing the week's meal prep and half listening. It was the one Yarrow family habit I had found genuinely endearing in the early years. There was something consistent about it. In December, the calls moved. They became daily. Then, in January, twice a day. And the location changed. He started taking them in the garage, with the door partially closed, which was new. The garage in the Harris Ranch house was attached, and I could hear the muffled register of his voice, but not the words, which was precisely the point. I did not confront him about it. Confrontation would have accelerated something I was not yet ready to accelerate. I noted it. I told Waverly. She noted it in her own file. We both understood what it meant. The second clue was documentary, and it arrived by accident on a Tuesday evening in late January. We were eating dinner. I had made a lentil soup that I ate almost every night that winter because it was the only thing that did not give me heartburn, and Colton had set his phone on the table face up, which he sometimes did when he was not thinking about it. The message notification came from Constance, and it was visible for 4 or 5 seconds before the screen dimmed. What I read in those 4 or 5 seconds was, "You need to be sure about this before the birth." I did not say anything. I passed the bread. I finished my soup. The following morning, I called Mr. Harlow at the estate office and asked him to send me a certified copy of the trust amendment. He said he would have it ready by Thursday. I picked it up on my way to the hospital for a shift. Have you ever held a piece of paper and understood that you were holding the resolution to something that had not yet happened? That is a strange feeling. It does not feel like power. It feels more like weight. 4 pages, notarized, signed in my grandmother's distinctive compressed handwriting. She had learned cursive from a nun in 1947 and it had never changed. And at the bottom, below the beneficiary description, the DINA confirmation clause in plain language. I put the certified copy in the folder I kept in the lockbox in the study, and I did not take it out again until after the delivery. I want to tell you about that folder, because it matters. I kept files the way my grandmother had kept files, a habit I had absorbed so early I could not identify the moment I had learned it. There was a folder for the house, the inspection report, the warranty documents for the appliances, the contractor invoice from the bathroom repair we had done in September. There was a folder for the marriage, the tax returns filed jointly, the beneficiary forms from both our retirement accounts, the prenuptial agreement we had signed at Constance's strong suggestion, which I had read 3 times and which contained no surprises. There was a folder for the pregnancy, the OB records, the insurance authorizations, the hospital pre-registration. And there was a folder, unlabeled, that held only the certified copy of the trust amendment and Waverly's retainer agreement and the card for Mr. Cho. Harlow. Colton had never asked about the lockbox. He had his own for his own documents. This is one of the small mercies of a certain kind of marriage. The documentation lives in separate rooms. The delivery came 3 weeks early. A Tuesday morning in late March, I woke at 4 and knew immediately what was happening, the way the body announces its business without asking permission. The mornings had been cold, the Boise River still carrying its snowmelt green, and I remember standing in the kitchen for 2 minutes while I timed the contractions and looked at the river light on the ceiling from the kitchen window and thought, this is earlier than I planned, but the plans were always approximate. I called my mother. I texted Colton, who was already at his office. He was an account manager at a commercial real estate firm and had left early that morning for a breakfast meeting. My mother, Bet, drove from Twin Falls. She made that drive in under 2 hours, which means she was not careful about the speed limit, and I have always loved her for it. The delivery itself was fast, which the nurses said was typical for a second pregnancy, but was, in fact, my first. My body had simply decided to be efficient. 4 hours from the first contraction. No complications. The room was warm in the way of hospital rooms that work to compensate for March, and it smelled of antiseptic and the particular synthetic floral scent of the hand lotion the nurses used. And at 10:47 in the morning, my daughter was born. She was 6 pounds and 2 ounces. She had ash blonde hair, a full head of it, which surprised everyone in the room. She was exactly what she was supposed to be. My mother was holding her. Colton was in the room. For 2 hours, everything was what it was supposed to be, a particular suspended stillness, the kind that arrives after something enormous and before anything else begins. I had a hospital braid I had put in before we left the house that morning, and I had never had time to take it out. And I remember thinking, I will take it out later, in the shower, when things are quieter. And then Colton stepped into the hallway. I heard his voice change register. It is the kind of change that happens when someone exits a room and enters a conversation they have been rehearsing. The social warmth drains out, and something rehearsed takes its place. I could hear Constance's voice through the phone, though not her words, which did not matter because Colton's words were loud enough for the nurses at the station to hear, and for my mother, 10 feet away from me, holding the baby, to hear every syllable. He said, "She is not mine." He said, "She arranged this." He said, I am filing before the week is out." Then there was a pause, and I heard his mother say something, and then there was silence. The nurse who had been in the room for the delivery was named Petra. She was about 50 and had the specific low-affect steadiness of someone who has worked labor and delivery for long enough to have seen the entire inventory of human behavior in a 30-foot radius of a hospital bed. She did not look at the hallway. She looked at me. I said, "May I have a pen?" She handed me one without making a face, which I have always appreciated. I signed the discharge paperwork. I put the pen down. The paper made a small, flat sound on the tray table. And then I called Waverly. She picked up on the second ring. I told her, in 2 sentences, what Colton had said. She said, "I'll file the paternity petition on your behalf. His denial gives us the mechanism." She said she would have the paperwork ready by Thursday. She said to take the baby home and let the Boise River be exactly as green as it was, and to call her if anything else happened. I thanked her. I hung up. My mother had not said a word through any of this. She was still holding the baby. When I looked at her, she met my eyes, and I could see the full inventory of what she wanted to say. 6 items, at least, and I could see her decide, one by one, not to say any of them. That is the gift my mother gave me in that room. She waited. I came home from the hospital late that afternoon. My mother drove. The Harris Ranch house was very quiet in the way of a house that has just been changed by an event it does not yet fully know how to contain. Someone from the nurses' station had left a cluster of congratulations balloons in the room, silver and yellow, the generic celebration kind, and I had taken them because it seemed worse to leave them. They floated against the ceiling of the back seat and made a sound like patience. I put the baby down in the bassinet we had assembled 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the early delivery, when things were still moving according to a plan. I sat in the study. The pictures we had not yet hung were still in their boxes, leaning against the wall. I took stock of what I had and what I stood to lose and what I had already secured. The divorce would be filed. That was certain. Colton had said it from the hospital hallway, and Colton, whatever else was true of him, did what he said he would do when his mother had approved the decision. The marital home, the Harris Ranch house that we had bought for $580,000 2 years ago and that had appreciated modestly in the intervening time, would be divided under Idaho's community property framework, half to me, half to him. Roughly $290,000 each, depending on the market and the timing. That was not nothing. That was not enough, either. Not in a city where childcare ran close to $1,800 a month and I would be carrying it alone. There was the custody question. I would have primary. I was confident of that. The denial was on the hospital record, now in Petra's notes and in the voices of everyone who had heard it, and the family courts in Ada County did not look warmly on a parent who had denied a child's lineage in the hallway of a maternity ward 3 hours after the birth. And there was the trust. I did not open the lockbox that evening. I did not need to. I knew exactly what the 4 pages said. I knew the beneficiary description, the biological child of Linnaeus Rensiniero. I knew the DINA confirmation requirement, drafted in my grandmother's insistence on precision. And I knew, and this was the part I had sat with in the parking lot of the estate office and turned over many times since, that Colton's public denial had just given Waverly the exact legal mechanism to petition the court for a compelled paternity test. He had asked for proof. He would receive it. He had not thought through what the proof would show. Let me explain this carefully, because the mechanics matter and I want you to understand them. My grandmother Helga had amended her revocable living trust in July, 4 months before she died. She was 84 and she had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition that made her prognosis a matter of timing rather than uncertainty. and she had spent her last months doing what she had always done, getting her documentation in order. She had called Mr. Harlow, and she had told him exactly what she wanted. She wanted her unborn grandchild to inherit the trust corpus. All of it, the Nampa commercial property, the Twin Falls house, the agricultural parcel, the brokerage account, upon proof of lineage from her line. The DINA confirmation requirement was her own language. She had not asked Mr. Harlow to suggest it. She told him to write it. He wrote it. She read it back. She signed it. The trust held, at the time of her death, $4.3 million in assets. The brokerage account alone was $2.1 million, managed conservatively and never touched in its principal. The 3 properties made up the rest, valued at the time of the amendment, though the agricultural parcel had continued to appreciate. What the DINA confirmation clause required, specifically, was a test confirming my child's biological lineage from me, not a paternity test, in the strict sense, but a test confirming that the child was, in fact, my biological child, and therefore a descendant of Helga Svensson's line. The simplest way to run that test, under the applicable lab protocol, was a standard parentage test that confirmed both maternity and paternity. When Colton made his public denial, on the record, audible to multiple witnesses, in the hallway of the maternity ward, Waverly had the foundation she needed to file a petition for a court-ordered paternity determination, not a divorce proceeding paternity question. A formal petition, under Idaho Code, premised on the formal denial of parentage. The court granted it. It was not a difficult case. The denial was on the record. Waverly filed on Thursday morning, 2 days after the delivery, exactly as she had said she would. Colton's attorney, a man named Reed Galveston, who had an office in the 8th Street District and a reputation for confident initial positions that sometimes did not survive contact with the facts, filed an objection within the week. The objection argued that a court-ordered test was unnecessary because Colton had not made a formal denial in a legal filing. A verbal statement in a hospital hallway, Galveston argued, was not a legal denial of parentage. Waverly submitted the hospital record transcript. She submitted Petra's nursing notes. She submitted the names of 3 other nurses who had been at the station. The court disagreed with Galveston's characterization and ordered the test. I had thought I was prepared for the administrative reality of it, the scheduled appointment at the testing facility, the chain of custody paperwork, the clinical forms that described what was being confirmed in language so neutral it could have been a routine blood panel. I was prepared for most of it. What I had not quite prepared for was sitting in a chair at a medical facility with my 3-week-old daughter while a technician collected the samples, knowing that the result would confirm something I had never doubted for a single moment. Colton did not attend the sample collection. His absence was noted on the chain of custody form. It did not affect the result. The test was administered to my daughter and, to me, the maternity confirmation portion, and to a buccal swab Colton had submitted separately, through his attorney, because Galveston had apparently convinced him that cooperation was preferable to a default finding. The results came back 14 days after the delivery. Waverly called me the afternoon the results arrived. I was in the study, marking up some occupational therapy, continuing education materials I had been meaning to finish before the delivery, and had not. The baby was asleep in the bassinet 2 feet from my chair. Waverly said, 99.98% paternity confirmation. She said, the estate transfer mechanism is triggered. She said, I'll call Mr. Harlow this afternoon. I thanked her and I put the phone face down on the desk and I sat still for a moment. The baby made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, the sound of someone dreaming something she did not yet have language for. I picked up my pen and went back to the continuing education materials. I want to tell you about a phone call that happened the day after the test results arrived, because it illuminates something about the way certain kinds of certainty collapse. Galveston called Waverly before he called his own client. This is a fact Waverly mentioned to me without editorializing when we spoke that afternoon. Galveston had received the results. The lab had copied both attorneys simultaneously, and his first call was not to Colton. It was to Waverly. He asked, in the careful language of a lawyer who is restructuring a position, whether there was any question about the chain of custody for the sample. Waverly said, "None." He asked whether the test had been administered according to the court's specifications. Waverly said it had been. He said he would be in touch, and he was. When Colton received the results, when Galveston called him, presumably at some point later that same afternoon, what he received was not new information about his daughter. He had known, on some level that he had refused to examine clearly, that she was his. Constance's 4-year editorial campaign had built a fog around what he knew, but the knowledge was always there, underneath the fog. What the results delivered was the end of the fog, and the end of the fog was also the end of the negotiating position that the fog had made possible. Galveston came back to Waverly that week with a revised settlement proposal. The revision was modest in tone, but significant in what it conceded. The paternity question was settled, the hospital record stood, and the custody framework would be built around the child's needs rather than around any ambiguity about lineage. There was a line in Galveston's letter, I read it because Waverly forwarded it to me, that said in the careful, passive voice of legal correspondence, "The events in the hospital have been noted and will inform the custody discussion." He could not quite bring himself to say what they were, but he noted them. I also want to tell you about Constance, because she made one more attempt. 3 weeks after the DNA result, she called me. I did not recognize the number. She had called from a phone I had not seen before, which was its own kind of information. And I answered because I answered numbers I didn't recognize, in case they were from the hospital or the school or any of the other institutions I dealt with professionally. She said, "I think we should talk." I said, "I'll have Waverly set something up." She said, "Not through attorneys. Just us." There was a particular quality to her voice, not the certainty I had heard in it for 4 years, but something adjacent to it, the cadence of certainty that has been asked to do more work than certainty can actually support. She sounded like someone who had rehearsed the conversation and was now discovering that the person on the other end was not following the script. She said, "You knew about the trust the whole time." I said, "Yes." She said, "You let him." She stopped. I waited. She said, "You could have told him." I said, very calmly, "I could have. But Colton shared everything with you, and I had learned what that meant." There was a silence that lasted long enough that I counted it. 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, you can hear a great deal in a silence. You can hear someone understanding something they had not been willing to understand before. She said she would have Galveston call Waverly. I said, that would be appropriate. That was the last conversation we had. What happened next happened on 2 separate tracks, which is the nature of legal proceedings when more than one attorney is involved in more than one matter at the same time. Track 1 was the divorce proceeding. Track 2 was the estate transfer. On the divorce track, Galveston's initial posture, premised on the ambiguity that Constance's 4 years of insinuation had been building toward, collapsed with the release of the paternity result. The ambiguity was no longer available to him as a negotiating position. There was no question of the child's parentage on the legal record. There was only the fact of Colton's public denial, the court order it had generated, the test it had produced, and the result that now sat at 99. 98% certainty in a clinical report, signed by a laboratory director. The custody arrangement resolved under Idaho law, with primary physical custody to me, given the circumstances, and a parenting plan that was realistic about the situation. Colton would have parenting time. He would pay child support calculated on his income, which ran close to $110,000 annually at the commercial real estate firm. The marital home sold in July. We had listed it at $595,000 and accepted $588,000, and after the mortgage balance and the selling costs, the net was split according to the community property formula. I received $290,000. Colton received the same. The divorce was final in October. It took 7 months from the filing. There was no contested hearing. There was very little to contest once the paternity result existed. On the estate track, the process moved separately and did not require Colton's participation at any stage. The trust transfer was between my grandmother's estate, the probate court in Gooding County where Helga had lived, and my daughter's custodial account. Mr. Harlow submitted the DINA result as the activating document. The probate court reviewed the amendment, confirmed the beneficiary identification, and approved the transfer. Waverly handled the coordination between the estate proceeding and the family law proceeding because she had the full picture of both. She did this with the specific patient competence of someone who understood that the timing mattered. The trust transfer needed to be kept procedurally clean from the divorce proceeding to ensure that the transferred assets would not be characterized as marital property subject to division. They were not. The trust assets were my daughter's inheritance from my grandmother's estate, and they had transferred on the basis of my daughter's lineage, not on any action taken within the marriage. Idaho courts are clear on this. The $4.3 million was Helga Marin's. But I am getting ahead of the sequence. Because before the transfer formalized, there was a Monday in May. The meeting at Waverly's office had been scheduled for a Monday, late May, 6 weeks after the DINA result, 3 weeks before the estate transfer would finalize. Waverly had scheduled 2 items for the same meeting, in the same conference room, the custody agreement signing for the divorce settlement, which required both parties, and an informational review of the trust transfer status, which did not require Colton, but which Waverly had included on the agenda because she had a very clear sense of how these things should be arranged. Colton had been told the meeting covered custody. He brought Galveston. He also brought his mother. He was entitled to bring a support person, and Galveston had cleared it. No one had told Constance what the agenda included beyond the custody agreement. I arrived early. I am always early. I was wearing a cardigan, dark green, the one I wore to depositions and documentation meetings. The one my colleague had once said made me look like someone who had already read everything before you got there, which she meant as a compliment. I had my copy of the trust amendment in my bag, not the certified copy from the lockbox that was already in Waverly's file, but a second copy, the one I had printed in November and kept in a different place. Because I was my grandmother's granddaughter and my grandmother believed in redundancy, I sat at the conference table and looked at the large window that faced the Boise River. The river in May was different from the river in March. It had settled from the snowmelt rush into something steadier, a deeper color, more patient-looking. There was a cottonwood near the bank that was in full early leaf. I looked at it for a while. Colton arrived with Galveston and Constance 4 minutes after the scheduled start time. He nodded at me. He sat across the table. Galveston arranged his papers. Constance sat to Colton's left, beside him, which was where she had always sat in relation to his life. Waverly was at the head of the table. Mr. Harlow, who had driven up from Twin Falls, was at the other end. Waverly said, "Before we cover the custody agreement, I want to address the trust matter because it provides context for the full settlement picture. Galveston started to say something. Waverly said, in a tone that was not unkind, but was entirely without deference, "This will take 8 minutes." She opened the trust amendment. She laid it on the table. 4 pages, my grandmother's signature at the bottom of page 4, notarized by the Gooding County notary in July, more than a year before any of us were sitting in this room. She read the beneficiary description aloud, the biological child of Linnea Svensson Yarrow. She read the DINA confirmation clause aloud. She read the asset schedule, the Nampa commercial property, the Twin Falls house, the agricultural parcel, the brokerage account, total trust corpus at time of amendment $4.3 million. Then she set the trust amendment down. She picked up the DINA report. It was 2 pages. She turned to page 2 and read the relevant line. Probability of paternity, 99,098%. Confirmed, she set the report down beside the trust amendment. The room was quiet. Colton looked at his mother. Constance looked at the window. She did not look back at him. Not in the first 5 seconds. Not in the 10 that followed. The cottonwood by the river was perfectly visible through the glass, its early leaves moving very slightly in a wind that could not be felt inside the conference room. And Constance Yarrow looked at it as if she had suddenly become very interested in trees. I watched Colton's face. He was looking at his mother, and she was not looking at him and the full architecture of the previous 4 years. The daily calls, the garage conversations, the text message about being sure before the birth, the hallway outside the delivery room, all of it seemed to arrive in his face at once, arriving the way understanding arrives when it is already too late for it to be useful. The confidence went out of him. Not dramatically, not in a collapse. More the way heat leaves a room when a window is finally opened, gradual, then suddenly thorough. He looked at the table. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked away. Galveston cleared his throat and asked a procedural question about the transfer timeline. Waverly answered it. Mr. Harlow confirmed the finalization date. The custody agreement was signed. The meeting ended. I did not speak directly to Colton during any of it. There was nothing I needed to say. The documents had said everything. On my grandmother's trust amendment, on the first page, below the heading and above the recitals, there was a blank where the child's name would eventually go. The blank had been left intentionally, because Helga had amended the document before the baby was born and had used the description instead of the name. At the estate transfer meeting, Mr. Harlow had a version of the first page with the blank filled in the estate attorney's hand. He had filled it in that morning with the name we had given her, Helga Marin Yarrow. My grandmother's name, first, my mother's middle name, second, she had never met the great-grandmother she was named for. But she had been named in her trust document for 8 months before she was born, held in the language of my grandmother's careful planning, a placeholder for a child my grandmother would not live to see. When I looked at that filled-in name on the first page of the trust amendment, Helga Marin, typed now in the formal estate document font, followed by the word beneficiary, I thought about a Tuesday afternoon the previous summer, when I had driven to Twin Falls to visit my grandmother, and she had been sitting at her kitchen table with her estate documents spread around her, and she had looked up and said, without preamble, "Does Colton know about the trust?" I had told her I had not told him yet. She had looked at me for a moment. She had the specific quality of attention of someone who has lived long enough to read the information people are not providing. Then, she had said, I see. She had not asked a follow-up question. She had gone back to her documents. I understood, in Waverly's conference room, looking at my daughter's name on the first page of the trust amendment, that my grandmother had understood everything from that Tuesday conversation. She had not changed the amendment. The amendment was already drafted the way she wanted it. the DINA clause already in place, the documentation already thorough. She had not needed to change anything. She had known, as precisely as she had always known things, that the document was correct. She had been right, as she had almost always been. I thought, she has always known exactly what mattered. I had learned it from her. The trust transferred 60 days after the DINA result, on a Friday afternoon in June, when the Boise River had settled into its summer level, and the cottonwoods along the Greenbelt were in full leaf, and the city had that particular early summer quality of light that makes everything look like it has been rinsed clean. Waverly called me when the transfer confirmed. She said, $4. $3 million to Helga Marinhero's custodial account, with you as trustee until she reaches majority. She said, congratulations. She said it in the specific dry tone she used for everything, which managed to convey warmth without sentimentality. I said, thank you, Waverly, she said. That's what I'm here for. I was sitting on the back step of the North End house when she called. I had moved there in early August after the Harris Ranch house sold. A smaller place, older, the kind of Boise bungalow with uneven floors and good bones and a yard that needed attention, near the Greenbelt and within easy walking distance of the river. It was a house that had been lived in by people who had put their hands on the walls, and it felt like that, textured in the right way. I had repainted the back porch railing in a dark sage green the week before I moved in, because the previous color had been a beige that was tired of itself, and the new color seemed right for a yard that had not yet been mine. I was sitting on that porch railing the evening Waverly called. The baby was inside with my mother, who had come up from Twin Falls for the weekend. The yard was beginning to do what yards do when someone pays attention to them. The previous owners had planted a climbing rose along the south fence that I had not known about until it bloomed. A full, dark, pink bloom that seemed like a piece of information the house had been waiting to share. I sat on the porch for a while after the call ended, in the early summer light. Do you know that feeling? The feeling of arriving somewhere you did not know you were traveling toward? It is not triumphant, not exactly. It is quieter than that. It is the feeling of putting down something heavy that you have carried so carefully for so long that you had stopped registering its weight. I had carried the knowledge of that trust amendment for 6 months before the delivery. I had carried the weight of knowing what Colton was likely to do and deciding not to prevent it, because prevention was not mine to do. The legal mechanism required his action, and he had provided it, and all I had needed to do was be prepared when he did. I had carried the retainer agreement and the certified copy in the lockbox and the number of Waverly's direct line memorized. Not written anywhere, just held. I had carried it calmly. I had carried it quietly. I had not told anyone except Waverly. And now my daughter's name was on the trust document. And the trust document was, in its first-page form, framed on the nursery wall of the North End house, not the certified copy from the lockbox, which belonged in Waverly's permanent file, but a high-quality print of the first page, mounted in a simple frame, my grandmother's name in the header and Helga Marin's name in the blank in the estate attorney's neat hand. My daughter will not know, for many years, what was said in the hallway outside the delivery room. She will not know it because I am the person who decides what she knows, and I have decided. With the full clarity I possess about what children need and what they do not, that she will know that she was wanted. By me. By her grandmother Bet, who drove 2 hours under the speed limit and held her in the first hour of her life. And by a great-grandmother she will never meet, who sat at a kitchen table in Twin Falls in the last year of her life, and amended a trust document with the precision and care of someone who believed that a piece of paper, written correctly, was the most reliable form of love she knew how to leave behind. My grandmother used to keep a small wooden box on the top shelf of her kitchen cabinet. Not a lockbox, just an old mahogany box with a brass latch that had been her mother's. Inside it, she kept her documents, the deed to the house, her marriage certificate, the military discharge papers for my grandfather, the trust documents in a plain manila envelope. She checked it, she had told me once, every 6 months. She made sure everything was current. She replaced documents when they needed to be replaced. I have the same box now. It sits on a shelf in the study of the North End house, next to the window that looks toward the river. Inside it, in a plain manila envelope, is the retainer agreement from my first meeting with Waverly, and Mr. Harlow's letter confirming the trust transfer, and the DAW report, and the first certified copy of the trust amendment. My grandmother's signature at the bottom in the compressed cursive she had learned in 1947, and never changed. I do not open it often. I do not need to. I know what it contains, but I know it is there, and I have always believed that knowing exactly what you hold, precisely and without exaggeration, is the only reliable form of readiness. The divorce was final in October. Colton and I share custody of Helga Marin under the parenting plan that Waverly negotiated with the patience of someone who understood that custody arrangements outlast the feelings that produced them. He sees his daughter. She will know her father. She will also know, eventually, that the world is full of people who will tell her what she is not worth, and that the correct response is not argument. It is preparation. There are people I miss from the life I had before. I miss some of what the Harris Ranch house was supposed to be, the pictures we had not yet hung, the study we had not yet finished, the particular domestic future that had been available to us before the architecture of it became clear. I cannot tell you I do not miss it. It would not be honest, and I have never found dishonesty useful. What I do not miss is the weight of carrying something alone that you should not have had to carry. That weight has been set down. It does not come back. There is a moment, near the end of a justice that arrives in documents rather than in speeches, when you realize that the quiet was not weakness. It was structure. It was the frame that everything else could rest on. And you understand that the people who mistook your silence for emptiness were looking at the wrong thing entirely. When someone demands proof, give them exactly that. Know in advance what the proof will show. Colton walked out of that delivery room asking for evidence of what his daughter was. He did not know the evidence had already been filed. He did not know that the evidence was 4 pages long, notarized in July, signed in my grandmother's hand, and that it had been waiting in a lockbox in the study of a house he was about to lose half of for 6 months before he said a single word in that hallway. The proof showed everything it was ever going to show, and everything it showed was already hers. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that delivery room when you heard those words in the hallway? Would you have argued? Would you have walked out? I think about the people who would have, and I understand them completely. And I'm glad I reached for the pen. Share this with someone who has ever been doubted at exactly the wrong moment. Someone who held their composure when the world was loud, and held what they needed, and waited for the process to do what processes do. Thank you, as always, for listening.